As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, an ink-black blanket slowly enveloped the woods surrounding Jane's secluded cabin. Perched on a hillside, it was isolated, nestled amidst towering conifers that swayed silently in the evening chill. Inside, a flickering fire crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth, casting elongated shadows across the wooden walls. Jane and Colin, snug and warm, were expertly cocooned in their shared blanket, tucking their feet beneath them as they settled into the comfort of another evening at the cabin. The weekend had been one of restoration, a timely escape from the frantic pace of city life. Jane, a reserved but rational software developer, had insisted on the getaway, yearning for solace and time to reconnect with Colin, a vibrant journalist whose curiosity often bordered on reckless. Their contrasting natures played perfectly into the night's relaxed rhythm, where they gravitated between silliness and deep conversations. "Do you remember that old legend about the woods?" Colin asked, breaking the tranquil silence that made the walls almost seem suffocating. Jane raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued but shrouded in skepticism. "You mean the one about the creature that lingers in the shadows? It's just folklore to scare kids, nothing more." The old clock on the mantel struck midnight, its chime echoing through the silent cabin like a haunting symphony. Jane and Colin sat before the crackling fire, a cocoon of warmth against the chill that had seeped in from the woods outside. They had spent the weekend nestled in this secluded refuge, hidden from the demands of city life. The walls around them seemed to breathe with history, adorned with rustic decor and the scent of aged wood. But now the atmosphere was thickening with an unsettled energy, a pressure that could not be ignored. Jane leaned back, her thoughts drifting back to their earlier conversations about the legends that danced through the locals' lips like shadows. "You really believe those tales?" she asked, a slight laugh escaping her lips. Her tone was teasing, though something in the back of her mind began to stir uneasily. "Those stories about creatures lurking in the woods are just that, stories." Colin, however, sat up straighter, his expression contemplative. "But what if they're based on something real?" he countered, eyes glinting with mischief. "What if this place isn't as safe as it seems?" There was an edge in his voice, an undercurrent of thrill mingled with fear. The fire crackled, the flames dancing, casting flickering shadows across the dimly lit room. Jane shook her head, attempting to brush off the strange tension that seemed to cling to the air. "It's just a cabin in the woods, Colin. There's nothing here but us and nature." But as she spoke, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window, and Jane couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine. Then came the sound, a rhythmic tapping, soft yet insistent. Tap tap tap. It interrupted their banter, puncturing the peaceful illusion of their evening. Both of them fell silent, the play of shadows suspended in an eerie hush. Jane's heart quickened, a knot tightening deep within her gut. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, trying to catch Colin's eye. He nodded slowly, his face pale beneath the dim light. "Probably just a branch," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. "No, that's no branch," Jane insisted, her instincts firing to life, urging her to dismiss it all as nonsense. "It's the wind, it must be." But a part of her felt the dread creeping in, clawing at her rational mind. Colin stood, an adventurous gleam illuminating his features. "I want to check it out," he said, moving towards the window. "You stay here." "What?" "No, Colin," but he was already halfway to the window, his curiosity insatiable. As he reached the frosted pane, Jane felt the room tilt just so. She joined him, peering into the inky blackness outside. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something shift, something outside the frame of the window. It was a shadow, flitting just beyond their line of sight, darting away too quickly for her to confirm what her mind was conjuring. Her breath caught, and the tapping returned, louder, more urgent. It felt alive and insistent, a plea or perhaps a threat. "Colin," she breathed, panic rising in her throat. "What if we're not alone?" The tapping crescendoed into a furious rhythm as Colin's eyes widened, his previous courage evaporating in the face. Jane grabbed his arm, her voice trembling with newfound intensity. "We need to get away from the window." But as they stumbled back, hesitation gnawed at them. Outside, the world was dark, too dark for their minds to comprehend what roamed beyond the cabin's blade-like shadows. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the tapping ceased. Silence enveloped the cabin, a heavy silence that felt almost tangible, pressing down in the absence of sound. Both of them stood frozen, listening intently in the stillness, hearts racing. The clock continued to tick, a reminder of their isolation as they exchanged a glance, knowing that whatever was out there was still watching. Deep in the woods, ancient secrets stirred beneath a cloak of night, and two souls found themselves at the precipice of unease, a boundary drawn not just in the wilderness but in their very hearts. The midnight visitor had made its presence known, but what it sought was a mystery yet unresolved. As the last chime of midnight echoed into silence, Jane and Colin's world had turned into a realm of palpable anxiety. The rhythmic tapping, now incessant and demanding, felt like a rough heartbeat against the cabin's weather-worn frame. Every thump resonated deep within their bones, sending icy fingers of dread creeping up their spines. "It might just be the wind, or a raccoon or something," Jane offered, her voice strained even as she tried to cling to reason. She was good at that, smoothing out the wrinkles of irrational fears with rational explanations, even when her heart pounded like a drum in protest. Colin, however, was a different story. His curiosity had morphed into an unbearable itch. He felt drawn to the source of the noise, where shadows danced just outside their view. "I have to see what it is," he insisted, rising to his feet, the pounding of his heart almost thrumming a nervous rhythm in tandem with the tap-tap-tap. Jane instinctively gripped his arm, her palms clammy and cold. "Colin, please, let's just stay put until morning. We can figure this out in the daylight." But her plea melted under the weight of his longing for confrontation, his willingness to face the unknown. She released him, and he grabbed a half-empty bottle of wine for courage, a futile elixir against the encroaching fear. Together, they stepped toward the frosted window, the bitter cold pressing against the glass like an eager breath. Just as he reached for the curtain, a violent flicker of lights caught their attention, a momentary explosion before darkness swallowed it whole. The power had blinked out, taking with it the very comfort that the flickering flames of their fire had offered. "Great, just fantastic," Jane groaned, panic creeping into her voice as they grappled for the flashlight they had left discarded on the mantel. They stumbled through the dark cabin, their hands shaking, bumping into furniture they could barely see. The peeling wallpaper and rustic decor suddenly felt monstrous, alive with shadows dancing threateningly in the night. Eventually, they found the flashlight, its beam cutting through the black. But the momentary relief waned as they heard it again, in the tap-tap-tap, now louder, more forceful than before, each strike echoing through the cabin like a death knell. Colin fumbled to dial for help, but only a dead tone greeted him. They were cut off from the world outside, a thought that delivered a fresh spike of fear through Jane's heart. Their eyes met, both suddenly. The tapping escalated, shifting from a disjointed rhythm to a frantic assault. They were no longer merely witnesses to some peculiar phenomenon, something was trying to get in. With ragged breath, Jane and Colin shared a harrowing glance, their previously playful banter erased by the dread mounting around them in thick waves. "What if it breaks through?" Jane fretted, clutching her heart, a fire poker clutched in one hand. "We defend ourselves, whatever it is. It's a survival thing now," Colin replied, the edge in his voice revealing the truth of his terror. Just as Jane brandished the poker, a dreadful sound erupted, a creaking crack that could only mean one thing. The window, weak under the relentless battering, started to yield. Her heart raced as she pulled Colin closer to her side, their old warmth of companionship now tinged with a cloying scent of fear as its embrace tightened around them. Then, in an unexpected twist of fate, the tapping stopped. Silence settled into the cabin like an unwelcome guest, heavy and oppressive. They stood there, panting lightly, the echo of dread almost louder than the silence filling the space between them. "Did it just leave?" Jane whispered, fear wrestling with hope. Colin held his breath, straining to listen over the song of thudding hearts. Outside, the forest had transformed into a still, dark shroud. The dawn would come, but they remained trapped inside an unfathomable void, waiting for whatever or whoever had been knocking on the door of their safety. And all the while, the smoldering embers of the fire flickered, hinting at a new day that brought no assurances, only unresolved questions and lingering shadows. As the first faint hues of dawn began to creep cautiously into the world, they stood there, two souls bound by isolation and inexplicable terror, knowing that whatever the night had brought would haunt their memories for a long time to come. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Jane and Colin stood on opposite sides of the room, weapons clutched tightly in hand. A fire poker glinted menacingly in Jane's grasp while Colin fidgeted with the handle of a kitchen knife, the blade reflecting the faint, flickering light of the embers that barely warmed the otherwise frigid space. They exchanged glances filled with uncertainty and trepidation, their minds racing with the possibilities of what was out there, a shadow lurking just beyond the frosted glass. The sudden silence after the cacophony of tapping was deafening, pressing in on them from all angles. They strained to hear any noise that might indicate the presence of something still waiting on the other side. The memories of the localized legends they had discussed just hours ago felt like a chilling mockery of their current predicament, and Jane wondered if they had unwittingly conjured this dark menace with their careless musings. "What if it's gone?" Colin finally whispered, his voice trembling as he took a cautious step toward the window, reluctantly lowering the knife. "Maybe it just got fed up and left." The words hung in the air, an uncertain hope that felt dangerously close to wishful thinking. Jane's heart raced as she replied, "We can't assume that. Whatever it is, it was trying to get in. We need to keep guarding ourselves." Her grip tightened around the poker, and she felt a surge of adrenaline as the unknown pressed against her very consciousness. Moments etched into eternity passed before Jane dared to approach the window. The chill of the cabin seemed to seep deeper into her bones, wrapping her in an icy dread. Using the poker, she nudged the heavy curtains aside, her breath catching in her throat as she peered into the early morning gloom. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and twisted, its gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers against the lightening sky. The world was muted and ethereal, only the soft rustle of leaves broke the stillness. She expected anything within her line of sight, a menacing figure or a glimmer of movement, but there was nothing. Only the haunting calm filled the space around the cabin. "See," Colin murmured from behind her, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with a fragility that mirrored Jane's own racing mind. "I told you, it left." But Jane didn't respond. She could feel a lingering presence that could not simply vanish, a tension that refused to dissipate. Just as she prepared to pull away from the window, a subtle noise echoed from the back of the cabin, a low thud followed by a rapid shift. Instantly, her heart plummeted, and she turned to face Colin, who looked just as terrified. They had both heard it. "Check it out," Colin suggested, though his bravado was undercut by the tremble in his hands. Jane nodded almost imperceptibly, and together, they moved through the cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath their hesitant steps, amplifying the disquiet in their hearts. When they reached the source of the noise, the kitchen lay bathed in early dawn, cold and still. But there on the floor, beside the trash can where they had carelessly discarded their food scraps earlier in the day, lay a heavy, wet object. They knelt to inspect it. Jane recoiled as a pungent odor of decay hit her senses. It was a deer carcass, partially stripped of flesh, its panic-stricken eyes now clouded over with death. "That wasn't here last night," Colin whispered, horrified. Jane nodded, her stomach roiling as a realization dawned on her. This was a warning of what was out there, a dark message in its rawest form. And as she turned, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting a fragile glow that painted their world in colors of semblance and hope. Yet, the relief of morning did little to ease the deep-seated terror that would unravel in their minds later. For even with the sunlight creeping in, they knew the night had been profoundly disturbing, and the sense of dread not quite dispelled would linger, like a shadow forever following in their wake.